Welcome back everyone, it's Aric from Rare Candy, and here today I want to kick this video off with a question to think about. How often in the Pokemon TCG when a new set comes out, you find yourself digging through the card pool and finding a handful of cards thinking, man, this card is almost good. If only the card designers had tweaked, this thing or that thing about the card, then it would actually be viable at that point. Well, when I was editing my past few set reviews now, I've actually found myself kind of having this commentary for a while, and I thought that might be a cool thing to maybe expand on and do a whole video series about. So today I'm going to attempt to redesign and hopefully fix a few cards that came out in Fusion Strike that I thought kind of missed the mark upon release. So by and large, I am going to attempt to remain faithful to the original design philosophy of these cards today, meaning that I'm going to attempt to more so iterate on existing aspects of the cards rather than completely redesign them from scratch. And also, I kind of want to be realistic, guys. As much as I personally would love to just jack up all of the HP and damage of all of the stage 2 Pokemon and shut multi-prize Pokemon out of the game, that's something I don't think would be very believable and would be kind of over the top.
Coward.
But like I said, this is going to be a new series for the channel going forward. So if you do find yourself enjoying this video, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below to let me know to do more of these in the future. And also just sound off below in the comments anyways. Let me know your thoughts on the cards that we redesigned today. And also, are there any other cards from this set that you think should have been designed a little bit differently as well? But with all out of the way, let's jump in and redesign 5 cards from Fusion Strike. So the first card we're going to attempt to redesign here is going to be the Rapid Strike Starmie. So Starmie, of course, is going to be a stage 1 Pokemon and has this attack: for a single water energy, you discard any amount of water energy from this Pokemon. Then for each energy card you discard in this way, choose one of your opponent's Pokemon and do 30 damage to it. You can choose the same Pokemon more than once, but this damage is not affected by weakness or resistance. So Starmie definitely has a couple things going for it right out the gate. It's a Rapid Strike card, which gives it a ton of support right away. It has 90 HP, which means the entire evolution line is level ball searchable, and you have an attack that's pretty flexible in terms of how you want to dish out your damage. But of course, the big issue with this card is just the actual damage output itself. This attack is almost identical to the attack that was on Bronzong Break all the way back in 2016, and that was a format where Pokemon capped out around 180 to 220-ish HP. So even though we have significantly higher HPs now, this damage has not scaled proportionally over time. So here's the new version of Starmie that I've come up with. As you can see, this is going to be one of the cards I made the fewest changes to. I kept literally everything about this card the same, as I think most things about it are fine, but instead of doing 30 for each energy we're discarding, I've tweaked that to do 50 instead. Because if we run through the math, if we want to take a one-hit KO on a Pokemon VMAX, just as an example, we have to discard 11 energy, and that's still not knocking out cards like Eternatus VMAX. Of course, a lot of the times you're not going to need to do quite that much. You would normally just use Starmie to maybe pick off something that's already damaged, but not even having the option for a crazy late game attack with this really limits this card's potential otherwise. The 50 damage multiplier I think is a lot more fair. If we do want to take a one shot on a Pokemon VMAX, we only have to discard 7 by comparison. Or, of course, if we are sniping something on the bench, we will gain access to things like Pissimian and Telescopic Sight. Now, with that being said, 7's still a lot of energy, especially when we compare that to something like Rayquaza VMAX that can do something very similar. But I think that is a fair number. This is not a multi-prize Pokemon, and we have the flexibility of targeting bench Pokemon, whereas a card like Rayquaza VMAX is going to be limited to just attacking the active. So the spirit of Starmie, I think, kind of remains intact with my small revision I made to this, but I think this is just enough of a buff to where I might actually consider Starmie, whereas previously I would completely write it off. Next up, we're going to take a stab at redesigning Crossceiver. I think this card was a huge missed opportunity, and hopefully after this revision, you guys will kind of agree this is more in line with how the card should have been designed. But the normal Crossceiver is going to be a Fusion Strike item card, and it says you must play 2 Crossceiver cards at once, but then you put a Pokemon or a supporter card from your discard pile into your hand. So you can effectively think of Crossceiver as half of a Rescue Stretcher or half of a Versus Seeker that you're forced to play 2 of if you ever do want this effect. And I think that's just really unimpressive most of the time. And tournament results so far for the Fusion Strike format has kind of only reinforced that this card is definitely nowhere near as good as Cross Switcher, and just in general, nowhere near as good as some of the other different recovery cards we've had over the years. Now, in terms of my revisions I'm going to make to this, I know a lot of people probably are looking for something like Custom Catcher, where you're allowed to play one of these at a time to get maybe a weaker effect, but I'm going to keep my redesign somewhat faithful to the spirit of this original card. I am going to keep the single effect here. I think the Fusion Strike mechanic is sort of aimed at forcing you to play Fusion Strike cards together, whether it's with these new Fusion Strike items, having a bunch of Genesects on the field, stacking power tablets for big damage, whatever it might be. I think that's just the general vibe of this battle style, and I'm going to try to honor that design philosophy. So as you can see for Crossceiver, it still has the option of getting Pokemon or supporter cards from your discard pile, but now I'm giving the option of getting 2. Effectively, each Crossceiver is going to net you a card that you get back, but you just have to play both of them at once to get this effect. So most of the time, it is still worse than a card like Versus Seeker or Rescue Stretcher, but I think it's finally decent enough to where cards like Palpad, Eldegoss V, Ordinary Rod, etc. don't completely outclass this anymore. Now, I did mess around with some different effects for Crossceiver, like making this card function closer to Ordinary Rod. Another idea I had was to change the supporter text of the card to include any trainer card, but I wound up settling on this much more conservative effect, as I think some of the other designs I was coming up with had a little bit of room for exploitation in maybe potentially a negative way. So I have to say, I'm pretty happy with where I landed on Crossceiver. It's still a card that not every deck would play, but definitely certain decks could make use of this, especially if they are a deck that does play powerful trainer search cards like the Inteleon Evolution line or the Mew from Celebrations, just as an example. It would maybe open up this card to finally finding itself a home. Next up, we're going to rework Swampert. Swampert, of course, is a Stage 2 Pokemon we recently got, and this Pokemon just really confused me on so many levels with what they were doing with this thing, and definitely was one of the first cards I really gravitated towards trying to rework. So Swampert, if you guys aren't familiar with it, it's a Stage 2 Pokemon, 170 HP, has this ability. Once during your turn, you may attach a Water Energy or a Fighting Energy card from your hand to one of your Pokemon. And it has 1 attack for a Water and 2 colorless is 180. And this attack also does 20 to each of your benched Pokemon. Don't apply weakness and resistance for benched Pokemon. And to round it out, also has a lightning weakness and a 3 retreat cost. So I have a lot to say about this, but let's start with this ability. This at a glance kind of reminds me of the Colossal back from Rebel Clash. They're both Stage 2 Pokemon that can accelerate multiple types of energy, but in the case of Colossal, that would actually allow you to accelerate both types. And it was energy from discard rather than hand, which is actually a good bit better. So it's just really bizarre that even with the precedent that Colossal is kind of set, they made Swampert just inherently worse in that regard. And likewise, I think its attack also leaves some room for improvement. So 180 is admittedly actually a decent number that ensures you can basically two-shot any VMAX in the format. That is really nice, but you are going to struggle against 2 prize Pokemon. That's going to be your main issue, as 180 just really isn't a great number against those decks most of the time. And the attack doing 20 damage to each of our bench Pokemon, I don't think is actually a huge deal. I think there are actually situations where that can be useful, especially if we're playing something like Morpeko or the Phanpy that both do more damage based on the amount of damage counters on them. So I think that part's fine, but what's puzzling is that it does not do damage to your opponent's bench either. So right away, you can probably anticipate some of the changes I'm about to make. So let's take a look at the revised version I have for Swampert here. So right out the gate with this ability, I've tried to make this much more in the mold of Colossal or the Dragonite back from Unified Minds. Now we have the option of accelerating 1 water, 1 fighting, or 1 of each from our hand to one of our Pokemon. This is by no stretch of imagination even remotely game breaking. This just makes Swampert slightly less bad, if anything. But now makes the card a lot less reliant on something like Twin Energy as it previously would have been. Because before, the idea if you were going to attack with Swampert would be to accelerate a Water Energy with this ability and attach a Twin Energy from hand. But of course, one of the big issues with that is that you only have 4 Twin Energy in a deck, and after you run through those 4, you're going to be in a much worse spot, and this ability would not actually be able to help you power up Swampert unless you had multiple in play, as an example. And also taking a look at this attack in the case of Earthquake, much like I was just discussing in terms of making Swampert a more flexible attacker, I've opted to eliminate the water energy altogether from its attack cost and just replace it with 3 colorless energy. One of the main reasons is that Earthquake is a ground move in the games. It's not a water move. So just thematically, I don't think it made sense to even have water energy in the attack cost. But also, since Swampert accelerates these different types of energies, having a colorless attack cost gives Swampert a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you want to build your energy lines for this theoretical deck. You could build this in a way where you just play twin energies and water energy, or twin energies and fighting energy, or maybe even forego twin energy altogether and just build your deck with just normal basic energies. Now, in terms of damage of Earthquake, I actually think the base damage output is perfectly reasonable. Like I said, that's a decent two-shotting number, but the big change I've made is that Earthquake now damages each player's bench Pokemon. Again, that makes more sense thematically given the video games. And also, even though we can't one-shot 2 prize Pokemon, if we can get off several Earthquakes, we can actually chip away at maybe a damaged 2 prize Pokemon on the bench to maybe pick up another KO at some point. And the only other change I've elected to make is getting rid of this card's really puzzling lightning weakness, because Swampert is part ground, and if I'm not mistaken, it is not actually weak to lightning. It is quad weak to grass. So I've elected to change its weakness back over to grass to properly reflect that. So with these changes, Swampert goes from being a card that is complete bulk to maybe being a half decent tier 2 or 3 deck, much like the Leonzard deck. And I'm much more okay with that than how this card was positioned previously. For our next card, we have another pretty straightforward revision, and that's going to be Hariyama. I personally thought Hariyama was a pretty cool card in Fusion Strike. It definitely reminds me of cards we've seen in the past, like Focus Band and Focus Hash, which have both been pretty important cards over time, but the final version of the card just kind of missed the mark here. So just a quick refresher on Hariyama. It's a stage 1 single strike Pokemon. It has this really cool ability. If this Pokemon would be knocked out by damage from an attack, flip a coin. If heads, this Pokemon is not knocked out, and its remaining HP becomes 10. And then just one attack for a fighting and 2 colorless does a flat 100 damage. So to be honest, I don't even have a problem with the fact that this ability is a coin flip, especially when we compare this to Focus Sash, which required your Pokemon to have full HP, but was not a coin flip. I think that is a fair trade-off. You can use this even if your Hariyama is perpetually stuck at 10 HP and your opponent's trying to knock you out every turn. But the big issue with this card, I think ultimately, is its damage output. While of course we do have things like Single Strike Energy to buff Hariyama a little bit with 2 Single Strike Energies and 1 manual attachment for turn, guess what? We're still only hitting 140, which is really not enough in this sort of format with Pokemon over 300 HP. If you want to successfully two-shot a lot of 3 prize Pokemon, you'll need all 4 Single Strike Energies on your Hariyama, or 3 Single Strike Energies and a Vitality Band to hit 170. And that's honestly asking a lot out of this thing. And I think ultimately the low damage output here is going to be sort of the nail in the coffin for this card. So let's take a look at the revision I've made. As you can see, I thought a lot about this card was pretty fair to begin with, but I've opted to increase the damage output from this attack up to 130. And suddenly that makes Hariyama's attack a lot more manageable. With 2 Single Strike Energies, that buffs this damage up to 170, which is kind of the magic number for two-shotting things. I know this is a single strike Pokemon, and they are normally aimed at taking big one-hit knockouts and doing tons of damage. But of course, Hariyama is a more defensive card, has this ability, it's trying to tank. So just for balance reasons, we don't want this thing to have a really good defensive ability and have an insanely overpowered attack as well. So I think the buff up to 130 is a completely reasonable thing we should have seen out of this card to begin with. And for our final card, we're going to take a shot at redesigning here. That is going to be Deoxys. No doubt one of the most interesting cards that we got out of Fusion Strike. Currently, it's the only Pokemon in the game to feature multiple battle styles, much less all 3 of them at the same time. So Deoxys, of course, like I said, is a Fusion Strike, Single Strike, and Rapid Strike Pokemon. It has just 1 attack for 3 colorless energy. It does 80 plus 80 more if this Pokemon has any Fusion Strike energy attached to it. While that's okay on its own, 160 is a serviceable amount of damage. The fact that it requires Fusion Strike energy to get this buff almost kind of negates the fact that it has these other battle styles that it can make use of. Even though in theory, there's all these different cards between these battle styles that you could run, the fact that you have to have Fusion Strike energy kind of forces you down a certain path with this card. And I thought that sort of wasted the toolbox nature of Deoxys. So that was my big goal I wanted to accomplish when redesigning this card. So let's take a look at the changes that I've made to this thing. As you can see, most of the stats are going to be the same, but of course the big change I've made is to this attack. It still has the 3 colorless attack cost, does 80 base damage, and does get a damage buff if you have a Fusion Strike energy, but this time it's only a 50 damage increase. While at a glance that looks like that might be kind of a downgrade for Deoxys, if we take a look at the rest of this attack, I've now included the added effects where if you have a single strike energy attached, you do an extra 50 damage. And if you have any rapid strike energy attached, this also does another additional 50 damage. With all this moving its base damage cap all the way up to 230, which is enough to knock out 2 prize Pokemon. I think if you're attempting to play a deck with Deoxys, you're already more than likely probably playing multiple energies of these different battle styles. Most likely probably Houndoom plus Fusion Strike energies or Rapid Strike energies plus Fusion Strike energies in Elisa Sparkle. And I want to really reward players for dipping their toes into multiple battle styles and give them more incentive to actually use a lot of the cool tools that Deoxys has at its disposal. The other issue right now too is that it's really difficult to build around Deoxys just because you only have 4 Fusion Strike energy in a deck, and once those 4 are gone, well, guess what? You're capped out at 80 damage, excluding things like Power Tablets or Single Strike energy, of course. So now the fact that you don't necessarily need Fusion Strike energy, and you could, in theory, just play Single and Rapid Strike energy, that now opens Deoxys up to both being maybe a tech in some of these other battle style decks, or even just giving you more deck building options to build a designated Deoxys deck as well. And honestly, I think all of this kind of takes Deoxys from being sort of a novel, gimmicky card to maybe actually being a more viable single prize basic deck, since your deck building options are a little bit more flexible and you have a higher damage ceiling now. And with that, those are going to be the 5 cards from Fusion Strike that I wanted to take a shot at redesigning. There were definitely some others that I thought maybe could use some tweaking as well, but these are the ones that probably stood out most in my mind to me. But I definitely want to know your thoughts, guys. Do you agree with some of these changes that I made to these cards? I know some of the changes I made were a little bit more conservative, whereas some of the other cards had slightly more radical changes made to them. And also, were there any other cards from Fusion Strike that you think should have been tweaked when they were designing them? Definitely let me know your full thoughts down below in the comments section. And of course, if you did enjoy this style of video and want to see more of these every time a new set comes out, be sure to smack that like button. Lets me know that you enjoyed this video and helps get this video seen by more people on YouTube in the process. But if you want to take your support to the next level, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch over at rarecandytcg.com. I'll have links to those down below in the description as well. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.